Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being in community with us today on the 30th anniversary of the 1992 LA uprisings. Today, our esteemed panel celebrates the launch of John Cho's debut middle grade novel, Troublemaker, woo, and discusses the events which the book is set around. I'm Candace Wingy Mack, and I am the managing librarian of System Wide Teen Services at the Los Angeles Public Library, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm zooming in from the ancestral and unceded territories of the Tongva, Chumash, Fernandino, Tataviam, and Keech that is now occupied by Los Angeles. We recognize and acknowledge the first people of this land, honor their elders, past and present, and the descendants who are citizens of these nations. We recognize that these tribes are still here and are committed to lifting up their stories, culture, and community. For more information on which territory you may reside on, check out native-land.ca. We'd like to thank our generous donors, the Future Ready Teens Fund, the Lenore S. and Bernard A. Greenberg Fund, the Library Foundation, and Little Brown Books for Young Readers for helping to bring this amazing author program to the Los Angeles Public Library. As a reminder, participants at today's program will have a chance to win a free copy of Troublemaker. Once again, just email ecdepartment@lapl.org for your opportunity to win a copy. Thanks to the Future Ready Teens Fund, copies of Troublemaker are also available for checkout at every single one of the Los Angeles Public Library's 73 locations. On this important anniversary, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the 63 lives lost and the many lives and businesses impacted during the 1992 civil unrest with a moment of silence. And now I'd love to introduce our amazing teen moderators for this event who are active members in the library's Teen Leading Change Teen Civic Engagement Program and the Koreatown Youth and Community Center's Koreatown Storytelling Program. First up is Fiona Herzog. Fiona Herzog is a junior at Palisades Charter High School, and the library has been her second home since her parents first took her to the Central Library to see a puppet show when she was 3 years old. When not at the library or studying, Fiona is active with her school's Envirothon team and the library's Teens Leading Change project, focusing on combating environmental racism. She relaxes by making origami, crocheting, and knitting. Our second teen moderator is Eunice Yoonha Shin, who is a senior at the Los Angeles Center for Enriched Studies, also known as LACES. As the daughter of Korean immigrants, Koreatown became familiar to her as she grew up in Los Angeles. She is the founder of the Film Production Club and co-captain of LACES Speech and Debate, and has won gold keys for photography and filmmaking in the Scholastic Art and Writing competition. She became interested in telling elders' stories after interviewing her grandmother in December of 2020. She was shocked to hear about Korea's history during the Korean War and Japanese imperialism, and it sparked an interest in journalism and storytelling. She recently committed to UC Berkeley as a social welfare major.
Hi, Candace.
Hello.
It's so wonderful to be here today. My name is Eunice. I'm one of the team moderators, and I would love to introduce our panelists, starting with John Cho. John Cho is a New York Times bestselling author and actor whose prolific acting career has spanned over 2 decades, from his breakout roles in the cult comedies Harold and Kumar Go to White Castle and American Pie, to his iconic portrayal of Sulu in the blockbuster Star Trek franchise, to more recently starring in his critically acclaimed and award-recognized performance in Searching and Netflix's Cowboy Bebop. Cho has continued to deliver compelling performances in both film and television, and has positioned him as one of the first Korean American actors in the mainstream to break through business and cultural barriers. His first book for young readers, Troublemaker, follows the events of the LA riots through the eyes of 12-year-old Jordan as he navigates school and family, and was released in March 2022.
Hi.
Hi,
Thank you.
wonderful to have you here.
Oh, it's so nice to be here. And you're going to Cal.
Yeah, I
I
just
went to
committed.
Cal.
Oh my gosh, that's awesome.
Yeah. All right.
Fiona, would you like to introduce our next panelist?
Of course. So our next panelist is Carol Park. She holds a Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing from UCR and is the author of Memoir of a Cashier, Korean Americans, Racism, and Riots, and the co-author of Korean Americans, A Concise Story. Park teaches English and Ethnic Studies at adjunct faculty at the University of California at Riverside, College of the Desert, and California Indian Nations College. Currently, Park is a graduate student researcher at the Young Oak Kim Center for Korean American Studies at UCR and a second-year graduate student in the university's Ethnic Studies PhD program. Park, a former journalist, has written for publications including the Press Enterprise, Koreatown Journal, Inland Empire Magazine, the Business Press, and various other news outlets. Her other works include the completion of a Korean American Oral Histories project and 2 documentaries, the 1992 L.A. Riots, Reflections on Our Future, and Footsteps of Korean Americans. Park earned a first place Society of Professional Journalists Award for her writing and was part of a team of academics that received a 3-year Academy of Korean Studies grant in 2014. Hello.
Thank you for having me.
Hi. Okay, and I will introduce our next panelist, Michael Woo. Michael Woo was the first Asian American and the first trained urban planner elected to the Los Angeles City Council. He represented the Hollywood area from 1985 to 1993. His accomplishments included the Hollywood Redevelopment Program, including the launch of the Hollywood Farmers Market, now the city's largest certified farmers market, and playing a key role in selecting the route and station locations for the Metro Red Line subway. In the aftermath of the Rodney King beating in 1991 and the 1992 LA riots, Woo was one of the most prominent voices in the city, criticizing police misconduct, but also appealing for racial harmony. In 1993, Woo gave up his council seat to become one of 24 candidates for mayor of Los Angeles, ultimately reaching second place and winning 46% of the citywide vote. Descended from an immigrant family, he is a native of Los Angeles, the first member of his generation in the Woo family born in the U.S.
Hello. Hi.
And,
Eunice, I went to Cal too.
Oh, awesome.
But a few years before you.
That's pretty cool. So I would actually like to start us off with the first question. John, could you please tell us more about Troublemaker?
Sure. Can I just start off by saying I'm so honored to be here. And I want to say that, when I dreamed about the release of the book, in my head, I didn't see it in a bookstore. I always saw it on the shelf of a library and available for a kid to walk in and read. So this is a real honor to be speaking at a Los Angeles Public Library event. I just feel that libraries are the seat of democracy. They don't recognize what's in your wallet. They don't care what's in your wallet. They don't care what your name is. And unlike teachers, librarians don't give you homework assignments. All they do is help you with what you want to know. So I just feel libraries are really, really important. They certainly were a really important part of my youth. I needed them so badly. So I'm really honored to be here. Thanks. And your question, Eunice, was what was your question? What's the book about?
Could you please tell us more about Troublemaker?
Sure. The plot is generally speaking this. Jordan is a Korean American boy. He's 12 years old. He's a little bit of a troublemaker, gets suspended from school. He comes home. He's fearing telling his parents, but they're unexpectedly home. And it's because the Rodney King verdict has been read. It's April 29th, 1992. The dad goes to the store to board it up in case there's trouble. As the boy watches the news, he grows increasingly alarmed that maybe something might happen to his father. So he decides, without permission, he makes the grave error of going to his dad's closet where he knows there's a gun. and he puts it in his backpack and sneaks out of the house to try and deliver the gun to his father for protection.
Thank you, John. And I actually found the book really, really interesting because of all the complex layers that just were in the novel. First, about being the child of immigrant parents, and also how he like how he speaks to his parents in English, they respond in Korean, how he speaks to his grandfather in English, and he rarely responds. And I feel like there were just so many things that that just rang a bell to me, and I really enjoyed the book. I thought it was a really important story, and yeah, thank you.
Well, I'm so glad it rang true for you, Eunice. I did try, and I drew from my experiences. I was about your age, maybe a little older in 1992, but I tried to draw upon my childhood and a lot of my friends and their parents and their homes, and tried to put those details in the book. So I'm really, really gratified that that it rings familiar to you.
Yeah, especially the part where they speak about the big fight. I don't want to spoil it, but um, just a
Have
lot
you had
of
some big fights with
parts.
your mom and dad?
Oh, definitely. But just the things that were said in that conversation, um, and how it revealed like each person's motives behind what was said. Um, it was just really interesting because I feel like reading from like the perspective of someone who's grown up and who's about to move out, like reading the story from a like teenager's point of view again and seeing the fight from his perspective was just very eye-opening, and it was just very much like, oh, I remember those moments that I had with my parents when I felt so frustrated and I knew my motives, but it was hard to convey that. And I feel like it, even though it's ultimately a story about the LA riots, it's also a big contributor in the perspective of it was being Korean American, and I really appreciated that.
Oh, great. I'm so happy to hear that, and thank you for saying so. Carol, I feel like you could probably jump in on this, but I think I don't know whether Eunice and Fiona's generation deal with this as much, but I certainly grew up with this twin pull, uh, it felt like the society was telling me you're not American enough, and my parents were telling me you're not Korean enough, and that seemed to be the source of a lot of conflict within the family. And I found it to be the case with my friends. I mean, do you still hear that sort of thing, Carol?
Yeah, actually, yes. You know, we tend to have that dual identity. We're Korean, we're American, we're not seen as either one. So it's a Korean American identity. And I think that's why your book is so powerful, is because it presents us with that Korean American identity, a melding of both. And it's still a thing today. I mean, it was a problem for me when I was a kid, and I'm sure Eunice and Fiona, you probably face the same things, like be a good Korean housewife, right? Learn to cook, right? All the foods and do all those different things, and you have your place and your role, but yet you're American. So yes, definitely, John, that's still going on.
Yeah.
Definitely. Oh, and just to segue into like our next question, I know that I've definitely watched a lot and seen a lot of the things that you were in. And how and why did you choose this particular focus of your work?
Well, it's a little bit of an accident, I'll tell you. And forgive me if this is a long answer, but I had a deal to write a book, and I wanted to write a middle grade novel because those are the years we were moving around a lot in the United States during those years of my life, and that's when I really needed books in my life, and so I wanted to, and I never saw a book with anyone that looked like me on the cover. And so I just wanted to do that. But as we were talking about what the book might be, 2020 came around and there was COVID. And so my kids were inside the house. And We were just watching the news, really anxious. And then we saw the anti-Asian violence happen. We saw George Floyd was murdered. The Black Lives Matter protests were going on. So it was a really chaotic and very dark time. And I found it very hard to focus on what I thought was going to be a really fun book. And because my children were home and I was trying to think about how to talk about all these things to my kids, I found myself thinking about April 29th, 1992. And then I wondered what a kid might have thought about it. And I was young, but not quite that young. And so I think it was my children that made me reimagine that event through their eyes. And then this story sort of came to me. The basic bones of the story came to me. And thankfully, my publisher said, "Yeah, let's go ahead and write that book." And that's what happened. I'm certainly not a historian, and I'm not a politician, but I just thought that this story might be useful.
Thank you, John. Is it okay if I read a small excerpt from chapter 7?
I bet you'll do it well because you're going to Cal.
Thank you. So it's when the teenagers are at Mr. Gary's house, and Mr. Gary is a Black man that frequented a Korean business, like a burger store in Koreatown. And he says, "What I'm saying is this: we don't find joy in burning the city," he says. "We find joy in joy. But it's hard when they keep stealing it from you, in everyday ways while you're trying to eat with your family, and in ways that make the news and give my wife a migraine that lasts for days. You're familiar with what happened with Rodney King and the verdict that was announced today, yes?" And the way that he explains it to these middle schoolers is just so, it was just heartbreaking. And I wanted to ask what, how your target audience influenced how you explained this concept.
Oh, that's such a great question. Well, these are very difficult subjects. This is a very difficult subject overall, and there were a lot of tricky issues in the book. But I felt that in order to be honest about these things, and at that age, you sniff out dishonesty from adults really easily, don't you? Do you agree? You're 12, but when your parents are trying to sugarcoat something for you. And so I wanted to be honest, but I also wanted to be responsible as an adult. So one thing that I did was, in the writing of the book, I worked with a collaborator, Sarah Sook, who is also Korean and who is a middle grade novelist. And I wanted an experienced hand to lead me through what was going to be some very difficult decisions. So it was basically writing the line between being honest and being responsible. But yeah, and the other thing that, in terms of Mr. Gary, I don't know if Michael Woo is still on. It looks like we lost him, but it was a little bit of a response to the media coverage at the time, which was really showing this mass of people. I think it painted the rioters as a mob, the protesters as a mob and a collective. And so it was very important to me from the beginning never to show the riots in the book or violence in the book. What I wanted was a contrast to what I saw on television nonstop during those days. And so I wanted individual encounters, and I thought that might be useful. And so to that end, I just imagined what that man might say to a kid that age. And that was kind of it. Good to have you back, Michael.
Sorry, I got kicked off Wi-Fi, but I'm back.
So between that experience, and now what parallels and changes have you seen?
I was wondering if I could hear from Michael, because I see some, I was really struck by how eerily similar the George Floyd incident was with the Rodney King incident. And, Michael, like from that time, when I first saw the news footage of Rodney King being beaten, that was a passing motorist, George Holliday, happened to have a handy cam. And I thought after that incident, okay, well, one, that's an open and shut case, right? We all see what's happening here. And then in the ensuing years, you had body cams, and then we have iPhones, and everyone has a camera. And you would think that, the activity, shining a light on these activities would be a deterrent. And yet we saw similar incidents happen over and over again through the years. And, most disturbingly, I felt like Derek Chauvin seemed to be looking down the barrel of the lens when he was kneeling on his neck, on George Floyd's neck, and so I'm dismayed at the lack of progress. I wonder if you have a different view, and that's where I was just starting from. It just did feel like, as Americans, particularly as an immigrant, I sort of take this idea of continual progression for granted. And yet lately I was feeling like either we're not progressing or we're regressing. And I'm curious about your point of view.
Well, John, first of all, let me say I stayed up until 4 o'clock this morning reading your book. I wasn't planning to read the whole thing, but congratulations on writing such a captivating story that definitely needs to be told. And to answer your question, I take a slightly longer view in that I'm a little bit older than you. I was living in LA back during the Watts riots in 1965. And so I look at it not only in terms of George Floyd and 1992, but even looking back to 1965. Why does this keep happening? And I think that the answer to that question is having the evidence is not enough. Having the truth is not enough. What we've missed out on each time is the political will to make a change in the way different ethnic groups relate to each other and addressing the underlying inequities in our cities like Los Angeles and in our society. And so, in other words, even with the advances in technology and the ability to record things on videotape or on an iPhone, it's not enough until we get enough people to want to make a change. And that's where we're still struggling.
Thank you.
That was a really thoughtful answer. Thank you. My next question actually is related to that. I remember through the Koreatown storytelling program when we were doing our project on the LA civil unrest, we watched National Geographic's documentary called LA 92. And that documentary really explored the role that media played in dividing Korean Americans and the Black communities in Los Angeles. And, it's been 30 years since the LA civil unrest, but there seems to be a lasting image of the Koreans on rooftops stereotype. How do you three all, in your work, research, and experience just with the riots, how do you think that it reflects upon this stereotype? And what are your personal thoughts on how it affects the view of Korean Americans?
Who wants to start? That's a big question.
Go for it, John.
I'll just say this. I'll just start here. What I was doing, because as I said before, I'm not a politician and I'm not a historian, but I just thought, what is the single image of Koreans that people remember most from that time? And it's the men on the rooftops with the rifles. And that was partly why I thought a gun had to play a part in the story. But I said to myself, well, who is that person? Can we follow him home? Can we find out more about him and his family and his children and how he feels and what his interior life is? And that's where I started. And with what I do, I just thought that what I could contribute is a story humanizing these people. And I feel like the sort of the opposite is happening in media. We dehumanize by turning people into things and single images and memes. And a book, I think, does the opposite, which is to fill these people in with color and make them alive. And so that was my aim.
Thank you, John. I would love to hear from Carol.
Sure. So the media representation of Korean Americans during the 1992 LA civil unrest was something that was built up. This notion of a Black Korean conflict, right? K.W. Lee, the first Asian American journalist, blah, 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 to be, anyways, he talks about this a lot, about how Korean Americans were portrayed in this negative light. Also, we were termed rooftop Koreans, right? Gun-toting vigilantes, things like this during the 1992 LA civil unrest. And that was never contextualized by the media. The media never really gave the story of why Koreans weren't on their rooftops. Why were we rooftop Koreans? Why was mom's friends over there, on the top of their businesses doing this? Is because media never fully contextualized this story, this issue that, yes, there may have been cultural differences between the African American and the Korean community, but they never truly addressed the larger issues, which I believe Michael had touched upon. And that was these inequities, the lack of investment in the communities, redlining, all these different things that really was the reason, police brutality being number one, right? That really was the reason for these uprisings, not interethnic conflict, right? But rather these larger issues. So media played a heavy role in that. And the way that Koreans are perceived today, Korean Americans, you still have that image of the Korean American male with the gun. That's how powerful that image was. It's something for us to think about.
If I could add something, I can't speak specifically for Korean Americans since I'm a Chinese American, but from a more general Asian American perspective, I thought something that was really interesting in John's book that he touched upon, despite the title Troublemaker, John mentions in relation to one of the characters this kind of duality about the image of Asian Americans as good boys and girls, versus the gang member or the troublemaker. And in my own political experience, I have observed both the positive and the negative side of the Asian American stereotypes. The first time that I ran for the city council, and I lost my election, but I remember walking door to door in the Silver Lake, Los Feliz area, where there had been a couple of generations of Chinese Americans and Japanese Americans, many of whom had been successful at John Marshall High School. And even though I didn't grow up in the neighborhood and I didn't go to John Marshall High School, but when many of the voters met me at the door and saw my face, they automatically assumed I must have been one of those straight A students who went to John Marshall High School with their sons and daughters. And that probably worked to my benefit. On the other hand, there's another side of the Asian American stereotype that has come out again very clearly in the context of the pandemic, in which Asian Americans tend to get blamed as being foreign, as being alien, as being un-American in certain ways. And so this continuing curse that all Asian Americans have to deal with is, how do you make the most of the positive side of the stereotype, but also come to grips with the negative side of the stereotype, despite what degrees you get from Ivy League institutions, or what success you make, or how much money you make. The way you look in this country can still determine the way you are perceived and the way you are treated. And that's very hard for many Americans to accept.
And I'll just add to that really fast. And I think, again, John, Michael has hit the point with it. Your book very much addresses this. This model minority is what Michael is referring to as this positive view of Asian Americans, and then yellow peril as this negative view. And I think your book does this really, really well. I think it was Jordan's friend, right? He says it. He says it like, oh man, we're this, we're that. Yeah, the perception of us as gangsters, or as, the straight A students, the good kids. And you putting that together in the book is a great way for young Asian Americans to understand we don't have to live up to that model minority perception, right? And we're not that yellow peril fear, that xenophobia, all that. We're not that. And I think what's so great about your book is that it gives voice to all of these things through the perception of a 12-year-old boy who's living through all those stereotypes. So it's great what Michael was just saying, and I just wanted to add to that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for answering that question. Those were really thoughtful answers. And I kind of want to build off of what Michael said about the existence of that stereotype of, smart students smart Asian students that end up at Ivy League institutions and have parents that pressure them so much to do their best and take on so many extracurriculars. Why do you think that so many Asian American families have such similar expectations or struggles, and so many children feel that kind of pressure or that kind of stereotype pushed onto them?
Let me start, and then I want to hear Carol's answer. But she's I'll throw it to the professor. But I will say that I always knew that the protagonist of this book was not going to be a straight A student, and it's because I grew up when I was your age. I was very resentful of hearing about a certain Peter Kim from Cerritos who got a 1600 on his SAT thrown in my face all the time. And me and my friends were just like, screw Peter Kim. Why is he ruining it for us? And so this book is a little bit of a response to that. And the idea of the book, I think every single character in the book could be labeled a troublemaker, and also could not be a troublemaker. And I kind of wanted to throw away all labels and make them all useless in the book. But I would like to hear from an actual academic on that.
Let me follow John. If I wanted to give you a very brief answer, I would say what I once wrote in an op-ed article in the L.A. Times, which is blame it on Confucius. In other words, there is a very deep cultural belief in Asia that I think in some ways is a stereotype, but I also believe it is a very powerful cultural belief that education is the route to success, and therefore you should respect teachers, therefore you should respect scholarship, therefore you should try to get as many degrees as you can from the best possible school. And today in the 21st century, that Confucian respect for learning and education as something that's good in itself, but also something that for immigrants, whether Korean or Chinese or Japanese or Filipino, works as a pathway to success, is a very deeply held belief. So I think that is part of it. And actually, it is to a large extent true, although maybe not for every single person. So I think that is a part of it. And unfortunately, in some families, it gets carried to an extreme, and it doesn't really reflect the reality, which is that you don't have to have a degree from an Ivy League institution to be a success in America or just to be happy. But I think in some ways that's part of the burden and the curse that Asian Americans have had to deal with.
So this I don't want to be too long-winded in this, so let me try to sum this up. What we're talking about here is that model minority myth, right? Where Asian Americans, and remember this term Asian American wasn't actually coined until, right, the late 1960s, when we realized we needed to have a larger voice. So putting us all together, that was a disservice to us because now we're all seen as the same. If you disaggregate that data, if you disaggregate the term Asian American and you look at each community, Korean, Chinese, Japanese, Laotian, Cambodian, all of this, you will see that we do not fall into this myth of model minority, which says, as Michael just talked about, that our cultural values that highly value education, right, respect, success, all these different things, they took this to an extreme. And in, I believe it was 1966, when William Peterson wrote this op-ed piece in the New York Times Magazine, lauding Japanese Americans for being successful after incarceration. This is when it really, truly was born, this modern notion of model minority. Suddenly, Asian Americans were these good, successful community members who didn't really speak up too much, even after they were incarcerated, were successful, trying to get education and living this American dream. When in reality, as John's book so very beautifully shows, this is not always the case. Just because there are some who do achieve a certain amount of success, people like my mom never did, right? Korean Americans didn't have that, right? If you look at the population data and you disaggregate household income, it may seem like it's inflated, but remember, you've got mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, right? Son with wife, all in there together. So we really have to think about how we're perceiving Asian Americans through this model minority perception that's actually a myth. We're not that successful. And to put it in one more perspective, this model minority myth is used to pit Asian Americans against other communities of color. So we're successful. Well, why? What opportunities did you get? And so there's this inter-ethnic conflict, which we saw kind of happen in 1992. But I'll stop there.
Eunice, the idea of the model minority myth is to keep the status quo the way it is, and to say, well, look at these Asians. They have zero going for them, and yet they're so successful. Isn't that great? And that's really meant to say, brown and black people, why don't you get your freaking act together? And the real danger of that is us believing in it. And that can happen. You know, I hear Asians, sometimes Asian Americans are the ones who throw around the most stereotypes about ourselves, I find. So we have to be careful not to, just because it's complimentary, it doesn't mean that we ought to accept those stereotypes.
I'd like to interject a family anecdote that illustrates how complicated the feelings are among Asian Americans about how to measure success. You know, when I was in the political arena, there was nobody who was a more fervent supporter of mine than my mother. But back in the 80s or 90s, in the city of Cerritos, there was an early Asian American named Daniel Wong, who was elected mayor of the city of Cerritos. In his career, he was actually a doctor. I think he was an OBGYN. And I remember after he became mayor of Cerritos, my mother, who was always very supportive of me, her son, running for public office, once said of Dr. Wong, why would he want to give up being a doctor to just be a politician? So this, I'm just saying this to illustrate to you that even in my own family, where, you know, my mother and father were extremely enthusiastic supporters of my political endeavors, and they always helped me out. But, you know, given a choice, you know, I wasn't a doctor, you know, and here's this doctor who's giving up being a doctor to become mayor of Cerritos. Is he crazy or something? So that's just to say that among Asian Americans, there can be ambivalent feelings about what constitutes success and what would you want to encourage your son or daughter to become.
Thank you all. Those were really, really thoughtful answers.
Yes. And as just one final question, why is the 30th anniversary of the LA Uprising so important to you personally?
I'll start. I just feel that in my lifetime, that was the event where it felt like a gang initiation rite into citizenship. You know, like we were just beaten up to a pulp, and then we were told, "Okay, you're American now." And it did feel that way, like we crossed some line in the sand in terms of our citizenship in this country, and things changed after that. The air was different, and it felt like the formation of a different kind of Korean identity. And so I sort of measure, you know, it's like in the history of Korean Americans in the U.S., I feel like there's before Saigu and after, and so it was. I guess I just felt the need to sort of reflect on that and understand it. I don't know that I really do. It's just I'm trying to touch it and try to understand it, and it's the way to understand what's happening right now is to understand where things came from.
I'll go next. To me, the significance of 1992 is it is a cautionary tale about how, despite how much progress we think we've made, we haven't advanced that much. And that it appears there are generations of racial violence that tend to burn in Los Angeles every 20 or 30 years. So to me, I think back to the 1965 Watts riots, and then 1992, and then the national concerns about George Floyd and the unending issues that are still unresolved. And so for me, it tempers my optimism, and it makes me think that we all have a lot more work to do.
I'm going to echo John here in that the 1992 LA civil unrest, a lot of scholars will say that it was the birth or the rebirth of the Korean American identity. That prior to that, Koreans were very concerned with nationalism, trying to, first it was free Korea from Japanese occupation, and then later to unify North and South Korea. But when 1992 happened, Korean Americans really realized, you know what? We're not just Koreans. And like John says, we're actually Korean Americans. And so their voice and their identity shifted. And so my generation, or John's generation, we grew up looking at things a little bit differently. Our parents came for that American dream, post-1965 Immigration Act. Most of them came in the 1970s. And they were looking for this, but they didn't really realize it until 1992, that things are different for us here. We have to recognize the racial history of this country. We have to understand that these riots, 1992, wasn't the first time, like Michael was saying, 1965. And then we saw it again with 2014, right? And I think it was Baltimore, right? 2015 in Ferguson. The police brutality and these macro issues continue to plague our communities and our society. And where do we go from there? That's the question. This 30th anniversary for me it's bittersweet, because having again been a child of Saigu, having my mom's gas station looted, right, and fearing for her life at that young age, I don't know, did we come that far? And where do we go from here? And I would say this: we need to trust each other. I stole that from Dr. Chang. If our communities start to trust each other, we can have dialogue. If we have dialogue, we can educate each other. And if we're educating each other, we can have peace. But that's a long road that we have ahead of us. And that's where this 30th anniversary for me is so significant, that we still need to get there.
Thank you all. Those were really wonderful and well thought out answers. I think now we're going to be taking questions from the audience. So we have Candace.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for this wonderful conversation. And yes, I've been on the back end monitoring the questions that have been coming in from the audience. And so, Grace Wingyan Toy and Rose Bystrom had kind of similar questions, which I think anyone who wants to jump in to answer is welcome to. And that question is, what message do you want other Asian Americans, especially youth, to take from the book, or what is one word or statement that you would like for your reader to apply to their lives to be a catalyst of change after reading the book? So,
I'll go first. I don't know that I've thought that much about it, but if I had to answer, I think it would be to replicate some of the conversations that Jordan has, which is to, as I was talking earlier, I think it's important to communicate face to face, one on one, and avoid taking all your information from media. And I think that communication is only the first step, but it's an important first step. To just to communicate with one another, community to community, be honest, and and speak to one another. We'll take it from there.
I'll go next. John, I was fascinated by Jordan's story because I think that he, in some ways, exemplified the Asian American youth who wants his parents to be proud of him, but he's got to struggle with it because he also wants, on a certain level, to define himself. He wants to make other people happy, but he also desires to be his own person. And so that was an inherent challenge in what otherwise to me was kind of a classic story of the hero's journey, going through a day and dealing with all these unexpected obstacles along on one day. So I guess the part of the story that I would try to bring out is how is it feasible to both make other people happy, but also be true to yourself? To me, that's what the basic story in this book is about. And at the end, especially with the epilogue at the end, I think it tells you a little bit or hints at how he's tried to both please other people, but also has matured a little about thinking about how to define himself. So that's one of the main things that I got out of the book.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would say the relationship building that happened in the narrative was absolutely fantastic. Between Jordan and it was Michael, right? I think his friend. Mm-hmm. And you know how they had that fight, right? They beat each other up, and then they go to the norebang, right? And they meet up there, and it's hilarious. But I think if I were to sum it up, it's the humanizing, like you said, John, of the relationships between all the characters, and that they're not these models. That the parents lost their first store, and they're struggling to make the second store be successful. And they have Jordan. I don't want to give it away, but Jordan's going through his own hero's journey. You humanize everything in a lens and a perspective that takes away those stereotypes and allows us to see those relationships that echo with us, that we can empathize and connect. And I think that's really very powerful from your book.
Thanks. I would like to add, if I, after having heard all those nice things, I would like to add something else that that for the young people listening, that something I tried to bring out in the book was, hey, your parents are actually people, and sometimes it takes us a lifetime to to figure that out. But they are human beings, and they have their own issues, and they have their own fears. They have their own failures, just like you, and their worries. And I think Asian culture in general is kind of positions parents as deities, and they can do no wrong, but I'm sorry to break it to you, but that's not actually the truth. Um, they are human beings, and I think if you know, in your relationships with your parents, I think it's useful to understand that about them.
A couple other quick lessons from the book: be careful when you're hitching a ride with a stranger, and be careful at a karaoke bar.
Those are hard-learned lessons.
It must be from your personal experience.
Yeah. You won't
Thank
believe
you,
this,
sir.
Eunice and Fiona, but in the 80s when I grew up, it wasn't uncommon to hitch a ride, and you might be in the bed of a pickup truck. We often rode in the bed of a pickup truck, our butts on. There weren't even car seats when we were younger, but anyway, that's just old man talk. Some old man details for you.
Thank you so much for those insights into what you know everyone hopes that folks get from the book. Personally, I also found the book to be a super fun read, and I guess as a librarian, you know, I just thought it was a wonderful book to have really fruitful discussions with readers of all ages, and in a really kind sort of introduction. And I hope that more people do research around the different topics that were brought up in the book. And now I'm going to try to squeeze in one last question from the audience, because I know we are getting close to the end of our time together. Juliet from BLT says, "Congrats on the book release, John. Is cross-generational healing progressing? And should LAPD redress for its PR campaign pitting Black and Asian communities against each other?"
Is cross-generational healing progressing? I'm gonna defer to Carol and Michael, but it's hard for me. I will say this, that I feel like younger people are much less sort of stuck in the identity ruts that we were when I was younger. And so I guess I have some optimism in that regard. It's you guys seem to be thinking more clearly than we were. We see things better than when I was young. So I feel better about that. And I can't remember the second part of the question. And about the police. I'm not sure specifically what she's referring to, but I will just say in general, I did want to bring out. I don't know that the general public recalls that the police completely abandoned Koreatown and South Central, and they were parked around the Federal Building in Westwood, and they were gone. So they basically said, "Do what you will," and people did what they people did so. So I think that they bear a huge burden of responsibility for their abdication of duty that day.
And I just want to give a shout out to Michael Woo, because I know when he was a city council person he was one of the only city council people who reprimanded LAPD for that situation. So I just wanted to throw that in there.
Thank you. Well, we could spend a whole other hour on the LAPD, but the younger members of the audience may not be aware of what John was just alluding to, which was, in addition to not responding to the cries of Korean Americans and others who were asking for protection, the LAPD utterly failed in terms of having a plan of what to do if a riot broke out. And so, in addition to inherent racism in the upper ranks of the department at the time, there was just utter incompetence that undermined the perception among some people that the LAPD was a very professional, prepared organization.
I guess, did you want me to answer and chime in with that? In terms of cross-generational healing, I would say, yeah, there's definitely progress. I know with my mom, she was that part of that immigration, that part of that wave of immigrants who came in the 1970s. And, when I was younger, when I was in my 20s, that my mom's generation didn't talk about it. They didn't want to talk about it. At the 25th anniversary of the LA civil unrest, they started to talk about it. They started to show that pain and that fear, that hurt, everything they went through. And now here we are, 30 years later. I think they're understanding now a little bit more. Is it 100% better? No. When my mom passed away, we still had our generational gap, but she finally understood, and I finally understood her. I think there was this moment that 1992 gave us where we began to understand that Korean immigrants and their children, there is a difference, and we need to bridge that gap by looking at each other, understanding each other, and seeing each other's experiences. And our parents had to learn to talk about that. They can't hold it in anymore. They have to tell us what they were feeling so that we don't make those same mistakes or we don't run into those same problems. So yes, I think there's a little bit of progress. And regarding the LAPD, should they be held accountable? I mean, yeah, for yes, exactly what Michael said, the abandonment of Koreatown and other communities. My mom called 911 how many times the first night of the LA civil unrest? Nobody came. So there should be at least some dialogue about that. And we should really talk about how these riots can probably and will happen again. And will our police force be prepared this time?
Another fascinating part of John's book is that is not the main story, but an interesting understory is the gun. What is the role of a gun? How should people use a gun? Who should buy a gun? And so, John, I thought that was another fascinating thread through the book that makes the reader wonder about what would the reader do in a situation like this if there was access to a gun.
Yeah, thank you. That was a tough one, but I also, again, I knew that Jordan's. I wanted Jordan's parents to have a gun because, as I said, I was working backwards from that image. But I had, friends. I grew up glamorizing guns, bang bang, playing cowboys and Indians as a kid, and all that stuff. And it certainly, and I think for Jordan, the gun was a proxy for a lot of things, for citizenship, for it represented responsibility and adulthood and America. So I think we have to talk frankly about what guns are, because they're in our children's lives, unfortunately. They're my kids are doing active shooter drills at school. I've told this before, but we spent last couple of years in New Zealand, and our kids went to public school there. And the first day of school, when the other kids found out my son was American, they said, "Have you been in a school shooting?" And I thought that was it was quite sad, that's our reputation across the world. And so I think we need to start talking frankly to our children about what a gun is, what it's for, what's responsible, what's not, and who should have it and who shouldn't.
Wow. Thank you all so much for such a wonderful conversation. I think that as the event comes to a close, I first of all want to thank every single one of you guys for being here tonight, and for taking the time to just talk about your experiences with the LA civil unrest, and for answering our questions and helping us get to know you guys all a little bit better. And I
Yes,
think
thank you
Candace.
so much for moderating, being such a wonderful moderators, Eunice and Fiona.
Yay!
Woo! And also thank you, of course, to our amazing panelists, John Cho, Michael Woo, and Carol Park. Woo! If you would like to see more of our amazing programs, please visit our online calendar at lapl.org/events. And for our Your Author programs, which this was a part of, at lapl.org/your author. One last thing too, just as a reminder, if you want to win a copy of Troublemaker. Please send an email to ecdepartment@lapl.org. And many thanks to the Library Foundation for sponsoring those copies. And of course, if you want to check out a copy from the library, please do so there.
Yay!
Woo! So until next time, we truly appreciate all of your support. The success of all of our library programs could not happen without viewers and participants and guests and moderators and volunteers like all of you. So thank you so much and have a wonderful rest of your Friday, weekend, and of course, leading into Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander Month. Thank you so much, everyone.